Welcome to training course, Digital Presentation and Preservation of Europe Ritual Cuisine. Module 2 Basic Theory and Practice, Theoretical Basics of Photography. The exposure and focus, aperture and depth of field. This lesson aims to provide students with the basic notions and concepts regarding focus and the depth of field. At the end of the lesson, students will know how to manage the tools that regulate the focus and how regulate the depth of field. In photography, it is very important that the object we are immortalizing is sharp and perfectly focused. A blurred photograph is wrong. A photograph in which we focus on something that is not the object of our composition is wrong. In fact, the human eye is first attracted to what is clear and perfectly understandable. This is because the human eye has a continuous focus, while objects will be blurred only in the peripheral areas of our visual field. Furthermore, our eye has no problems in focusing if the parameters of distance, light and movement of the scene we are looking at change. The human eye is a perfect machine. The camera, on the other hand, does not have the same capacity as the human eye but works differently. When we aim the camera to photograph a scene, the focus occurs only on the object that is placed on the focal plane of our camera. If we move further or closer, that object will be less sharp and will lose detail. The plane of focus is the one that contains all the points that have the same distance from the camera sensor and that are equally in focus in a single shot. In fact, the camera is able to focus only on points that are at an equal specific distance, which is called the plane of focus. The camera can only focus on one plane of focus at a time. Anything that is not understood on that plane is out of focus. But if the focal plane can only be one, how is it possible that, for example, in landscape photos everything is in focus? This is possible because the concept of focus is closely linked to that of depth of field, but we will talk about this later. When we talk about focusing, we must specify that we are talking about adjusting the distance between the objective lenses and the photographic sensor, in order to capture a sharp image. The focus can be adjusted in automatic mode or manual mode. As we said, since the focus is adjusted in the lens, the focus mode is usually selectable directly from a switch on the lens mounted on the camera. Autofocus can take place according to an active system or a passive system. With the system active, infrared rays are emitted which calculate the distance between the object and the lens. The camera then calculates the focus. With the passive system, on the other hand, the focus is obtained by capturing the light emitted by the subject itself. In particular, the passive system is based on contrast measurement. When the contrast is maximum, the focus is also maximum. This is the method most used by cameras of any type, from smartphones to more expensive reflex cameras. As for focusing, SLR cameras have three focus modes: single, AFS for Nikon, and one shot for Canon, continue, AFC for Nikon and AF servo for Canon, automatic, AF auto for Nikon and AF focus for Canon. When we shoot in single autofocus mode, if you half-click the shutter button, the camera starts focusing on the subject you have decided to capture. Single autofocus is the right choice to use with static subjects, because the focusing procedure starts and ends only once when you press the shutter button halfway. Use single autofocus, for instance, if you need to photograph still subjects, take a portrait or photograph a landscape. Continuous focus can be used when we are photographing moving subjects. In this mode, by pressing the shutter button halfway, the camera activates autofocus and continues to focus on the subject as it moves. Continuous autofocus is very useful when you have to photograph subjects that continuously move according to a certain trajectory. Then, by pressing the shutter button halfway, your camera's autofocus system locks onto the subject and follows it until the picture is taken. Using continuous focus isn't easy. The success of a photograph depends on the speed with which the subject moves and on its trajectory, which must be perceivable. Use continuous focus, for instance, if you need to photograph children, animals, athletes such as runners. Finally, the automatic mode gives your camera the choice of whether to use single or continuous focus. The focus points are displayed in the camera's viewfinder and help us understand what our camera is focusing on. Focus points are an important tool because we can set certain points to decide what needs to be in focus. The number of points varies according to the cameras. They can range from 5 points to 51 in the most sophisticated and expensive cameras. When we activate the autofocus, our viewfinder will indicate what it is focusing on, but we can decide which focus points we want to be working and thus choose what to focus exactly. In digital cameras we can therefore set a central focus point that corresponds to the most precise and sensitive sensor, a focus point that our camera chooses, and this will depend on the distance from the subject, the mounted lens and other external factors. Finally, we can select any focus point that is most convenient for the photographic composition we are setting. Depth of field is one of the main creative tools that the photographer has at his disposal. The depth of field control allows the photographer to express his creativity using the camera without the intervention in post-production. What is the depth of field? Depth of field is the area that our eye perceives sharp. We must be careful. In fact, this area does not correspond to the focal plane, which is only one, but corresponds to the area in front of and behind the focal plane. The width of this sharp area is therefore the depth of field of our photography. Learning how to control it is relatively complex. We must learn to manage three main factors. What are the three factors on which depth of field depends? The factors that allow us to control the depth of field are the aperture, the focal length and the distance of the subject we are photographing. Let's start with the opening of the diaphragm. Regarding the aperture, we have to remember a simple rule: the larger the aperture, the smaller the depth of field. Consequently, the smaller the aperture, the greater the depth of field. This simple rule is complicated by how the aperture is indicated. In the previous lessons we have seen that it is indicated with the symbol f/. We only have to remember that the smaller the number after the f, the greater the aperture. As we can see from the infographic, the aperture f2.8 is greater than the aperture f11, consequently the depth of field will be smaller with an aperture set to f2.8 compared to an aperture set to f11. So the people behind the person placed on the plane focal lengths will be seen more clearly as we close the diaphragm. Another factor that determines the depth of field is the focal length of the lens we are using. The focal length of a lens physically, it is the distance between the optical center of the lens and the plane of focus, i.e. the sensor. This is why it is also called focal distance. It is measured in millimeters and it is an intrinsic feature of the lens, and you will always find it indicated on the outside. Again, we have a simple rule: the longer the focal length of the lens, the shorter the depth of field. The shorter the focal length of the lens, the greater the depth of field. This rule makes us understand how important it is to choose the right lens depending on the subject we want to photograph. If we want to photograph a naturalistic landscape and have a large depth of field and therefore large clear areas, we will opt for a wide-angle lens or a lens with a focal length of less than 50 mm. If we want to take a portrait and therefore focus on a person's face and have the rest less sharp or blurred, then we will use a lens with a focal length above 50 mm. The last factor that determines the depth of field is the distance to the subject. Also for this factor we have a simple rule: the closer the subject is in focus, the smaller the depth of field. The more distant the subject is in focus, the greater the depth of field. This factor, however, should be used carefully because approaching or moving away from the subject we modify the framing and above all the composition of our photograph. Therefore, summarizing the three fundamental factors to control the depth of field are the aperture, the focal length of the lens that we have mounted on our camera, and finally the distance of the subject we want to photograph. To end our lesson on focus and depth of field, let's tackle the theme of creativity that can be expressed with the mastery of these factors. Deciding what to bring into the zone of sharpness, or deciding the depth of field of photography, is one of the most important elements through which to express your creativity. In the portraits it is very important to highlight the face of the subject we are photographing. This can be done by leaving the face sharp and leaving the background blurry. This effect is called the bokeh effect. Bokeh is a Japanese word meaning fuzzy. This effect allows you to hide an unbeautiful and interesting background, guide the eye of the viewer towards the point of interest, add a touch of magic, especially with the bokeh of lights. To get the blurred in photography and then the bokeh effect, you have to follow these few rules: focus the subject, use the maximum aperture of your lens, use as long as possible focal length, modulate the effect you want to achieve by playing with distances. When we want to photograph a set of subjects or a panorama, it is very important to have the ability to control the depth of field. In the photography of natural landscapes it is necessary that everything is very clear to be able to show the magnificence of nature as mountains, waterfalls, forests. If we are photographing in open spaces such as streets or squares, we can decide to make everything clear, but we risk to flatten the image. If we want instead to focus the gaze of our viewer on some subject in particular, depth of field management is very important and allows us to focus the viewer's eye on what is important to us. We saw in this lesson how focus and depth of field works. As for the depth of field, the most used factor in photography is that of the aperture. You can try how it works by doing a small exercise. Take 3 bottles where you can clearly read the brand. Take your camera and go outdoors, during the day, in a well-lit area, so you can shoot without problems at any aperture. Place the bottles in a row about 40 centimeters apart. Stand on the same line as the bottles, at a distance of 1.5 meters from the first, and with the camera at the same height. Set the camera to diaphragm priority mode and then focus on the first bottle, at the maximum opening that allows your camera. Just step away a bit if you can't focus. Take a second picture, but this time with as little opening as possible. You will notice that in the first photo only the first bottle is in focus, while in the second one will also be in focus and maybe a piece of the third, or even all 3, depending on the camera and the lens you have. You will also notice that changing the depth of field completely changes the perception of the subject in the photo. And that's one of the reasons that depth of field is such an important creative resource. The course was created by the consortium of the Eurica project funded by the Erasmus Plus program. Thanks for the attention.